First things first, sorry about the setup. I have an extra dog visiting my house and I'm not trying to have two dogs running rampant, trying to knock my camera off the tripod. This is going to be an individual review channel. So I am going to be providing cawpile reviews for every single book that I read moving forward so that I can mitigate the need for 45-minute long recaps where I share my stupid dumb opinion with everybody who doesn't want to hear it. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, welcome back. If you are a returning guest, my name is Brittany. I like to share my stupid opinion on books and let y'all know what I'm thinking about the books that I'm reading as I read them. Today we're starting with The Whispering Room by Dean Koontz, which I have on my lap. This book is the second book in the Jane Hawk series. I did not read the first book, which is called The Silent Corner. I will preface this by saying I do not feel like it hindered my ability to grasp what was happening in the second book. My children's grandma read the first book and we buddy read The Whispering Room. She said that the first book does provide a lot of important details for the plot in the second book, but we're not spending the second book rehashing a lot of what does happen in the first book. So the second book picks up as Jane has taken her son into hiding and she's mourning the loss of her husband. Her husband took his own life. So she's very motivated by her love for him, but also her fear for her son, because in book one, apparently, the bad guys have told her what they will do to her son, none of which is appropriate to share on YouTube, and something that I very much dislike as somebody who doesn't like to read about harm coming to children. With that said, we are following along with Jane as she uncovers this plot for essentially mind control set forth by the US government, which causes her to go rogue as an FBI agent. It was a very, very fun ride. If you can, I recommend that you listen to the audiobook. I double dorked it, read along with this, listened to the audiobook at the same time. I really liked the narrator. Some of this book takes place in Minnesota. The narrator for the book does do a really wonderful Minnesotan accent. I enjoyed it. This book is quite hefty, as you can see. I read it in like a day and a half because I listened to the audiobook at like 3 times speed because the narrator talked so slowly. So let's go ahead and run through the cawpile of it. 4 characters. I feel like Jane was very, very clearly a super well thought out and developed character. I found her to be very, very, very realistic and super, super badass. I loved it. The sheriff in Minnesota, whose name I'm completely blanking on right now, I really enjoyed his character too and found him to be equally as thought out as Jane, which makes sense because he does play a huge role in this book, especially once the 2 characters link up. Other kind of important characters that are side characters, I didn't really find them to be as interesting, notable as Jane and the sheriff from Minnesota. For example, the sheriff's family, I wasn't really too invested in what was going on with them, even though they do play a huge part of the plot of this book. I think that besides Jane and the sheriff, the other standout characters of this book are the children in the town in Kentucky. If you read this book, you will know what I'm talking about. I felt like the children are the very definition of bravery, even though what was happening to them was making me feel very, very, very sad. It's okay. I found that I couldn't really complain about the characters except the journalist, Larry, who was, for absolutely no reason at all that I could understand, hyper fixated on Jane's boobs. For the characters, I gave it an 8 out of 10, and we're moving on to the atmosphere. This book, we spend bouncing all over the United States. We are in Minnesota, we are in Texas, we are in Kentucky, we are all over the place, and I really loved it. I think that the atmosphere is made better by the narrator. I really enjoyed following Jane along her plot for vengeance. It was very, very entertaining, but I will say that part 1 felt a little convoluted when we were bouncing around between Jane and the investigation that's going on in Minnesota. This, for me, really could just be a me thing. And so if you feel differently, great. This is just what I'm thinking. The beginning felt a little slow and clunky. This is why I kind of gave it a 7 out of 10, because after part 1, the pacing picked up and I didn't struggle anymore. The first 110 pages of this book are part 1 and it felt a little slow and clunky to me. Wasn't really a huge fan of that, but it's fine. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for atmosphere. I've never read Dean Koontz before. I do have a lot of his books in my collection because I've heard a lot of really wonderful things about his his writing. I personally would consider Dean Koontz, having read one book from him, to be one of the greats when it comes to writing. I said in my notes for this that I docked points for writing for making Larry such a fucking nasty man, but otherwise I had no complaints for the writing. I think it's incredibly well written, and I am planning on reading more of his books in the future. Really, really, really liked his writing. This one's more of a thriller, and I know that he writes a lot of horror because friends who have recommended Dean Koontz to me are the ones who read horror and they're like, oh, he's super messed up. Don't read his books. He's super scary. That's my knowledge of Dean Koontz. Moving forward with the plot, again, this could just be a me thing, and it could just be because I didn't read book one, but for the plot, I wasn't really as invested in the plot as I would have liked. I felt like there were parts that were kind of all over the place. There's so much that happens. I feel like we're introduced to character after character, and some of them are very irrelevant to the story. In particular, I'm talking about a family that Jane encounters that's traveling via RV at one point in the plot. I just didn't feel like they had really a relevant role other than allowing Jane to like show out that she was an FBI agent and that she sees things that normal people wouldn't see. I might have just missed how they were relevant to the plot, this family. Basically, the whole plot of this book is that people are injected with this serum that makes them able to be controlled by the government, malleable, if you will, by the government. Say this one phrase to get them to do what you want, and they'll do anything that you want. I didn't really love what was happening in this book. I was really struggling with the pacing, I think. I said in my notes that the plot was decent, but I was expecting something a little bit more thrilling. And so I gave the plot a 6 out of 10. Intrigue. Linked to plot for this one for me. The plot is the driving factor behind this book, and I don't mind books that are focused more heavily on plot than characters, but I did find myself getting frustrated and annoyed at things that I didn't think were relevant to the plot. See my notes before on that family. The things that I take issue with in this book may come out in future books to be relevant to the plot, but with it being book 2, I was just very much struggling with staying interested in what was going on. Really, truthfully, I find that double dorking books helps to keep my interest alive, and I will say that in this case it is no different. I managed to keep invested in the story because I was listening to the audiobook and reading along at the same time, and this is kind of why I gave it just above average for a score. If you hear my son shouting at Fortnite, just pretend like he's not. I think that I gave it just above average for the score because I double dorked this. For logic, I found that at first it seemed Jane's decisions were very rooted in vengeance, and it didn't feel like she was doing things for the right reason. It seemed like she was doing things because it was what was going to protect her son or what she could do to avenge her husband, and it never really felt like in the beginning that she was doing things because it was for the greater good. Even with that being said, I did find that the decisions that Jane was making were very logical, even if I didn't personally agree with them. Side characters' decision making really also boiled down to being very logical for me, especially with the sheriff from Minnesota and the kids from the town in Kentucky. The one character whose logic I didn't really jive with was the sheriff's daughter. She was very, very smart, but as someone who has siblings, if my siblings are acting weird, I'm gonna tell on them. No matter what, I would tell on them in a second if they were acting so out of character. And I don't know if that's because I'm the oldest sibling, whereas the sheriff's daughter in this situation is the younger sibling. I didn't think that what she was deciding was very logical, just based off of the defining characteristic of her being a super intelligent teenager. So with that said, I gave logic an 8 out of 10, and we're moving on to enjoyment. I did think that this book was very decent overall. Enjoyed the narrator for the audiobook, and I think that my complaints with the plot kind of linked to my enjoyment of this book. Found myself really struggling to continue at some points because I couldn't see how what was happening was really relevant to the plot, but I do, like I said, recommend the narrator for the audiobook. So if you can listen to the audiobook, really do so because the Minnesotan accent makes it entirely worth it. Overall, I'm going to link my enjoyment to the intrigue and the plot for this one, and I gave it a 6. My overall score was 50 out of 70. My average was 7.14, and as you can see here on this little postcard, which maybe you can't see, I kind of did some math and figured out my new rating system. The star equivalent for a 7.14 is 3.75 stars for me for The Whispering Room by Dean Koontz. Final thoughts. I don't own any additional Jane Hawk novels, so I don't plan on continuing the series at this time. I'm also not planning on going back and reading The Silent Corner. I just don't have time for that. I have other things that I'd like to read before we decide to circle back to any more of the Jane Hawk novels. Have plenty more Dean Koontz books on my shelves, so if you have recommendations for other Dean Koontz books that I should look into, maybe I have it on my shelf and I can get to it sooner rather than later. With all of that being said, I am finished with my review for this book. I will see you all in my next video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please feel free to do so. If you like the video, leave me a like. With all that being said, I'll see you all next time for another cawpile review. Goodbye.